Hey guys, tonight we're digging into one of those stories that sounds too ridiculous to be true, but it absolutely happened. Imagine this, you're in medieval Europe, it's late at night, and you hear a strange, frantic rustling under your bed. No, it's not a ghost or a rogue knight. It's a cat, except, well, you're not supposed to have one. You slide off the bed, feet brushing against rough stone floors, and there it is, a flash of fur, a pair of gleaming eyes. That's when you remember, the Pope himself, yes, the Pope, has declared war on cats. You probably won't survive this timeline without a few fleas, a plague, and a complete misunderstanding of biology, so fair warning. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Drop it in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You lean in closer to the ancient scrolls piled on the creaking wooden table. Their edges crumble like dry leaves at your touch. Written in heavy Latin, splattered with faded ink, they spell out one of the strangest decrees ever issued by the Church, a papal bull denouncing cats as agents of the devil. The culprit? Pope Gregory IX. His official stance was that cats, especially black ones, were not merely suspicious creatures, they were actively malevolent, woven into the dark tapestry of witchcraft and heresy. Now, this wasn't some random medieval rumor bubbling up from the local tavern. This was official policy. It's like the ultimate case of institutionalized pet discrimination. Imagine a law today banning goldfish because someone decided they were secretly plotting our demise. That's the level of absurdity we're dealing with. Historians still argue whether Gregory IX truly hated cats or if he was just swept up in a much larger tide of fear and superstition already gripping Europe. Either way, his decree kicked off a chain reaction no one could have anticipated, one that involved not just the fate of cats, but arguably, the fate of humanity itself. The candles flicker, casting elongated, wriggling shadows that seem almost alive. In a world where almost every bump in the night is considered an omen, where pestilence is a breath away, and where salvation and damnation are everyday conversation topics, it's perhaps no surprise that a creature as independent and mysterious as a cat would come under suspicion. You lean back in your creaky chair, picturing a world without the lazy comfort of a cat curled at your feet. Not just a world without pets, but a world actively hostile to them. A world where a midnight purr could be the sound of danger, not delight. Now, medieval Europe didn't have the luxury of understanding things like germ theory or pest control. They didn't realize cats were, in fact, their best line of defense against disease-carrying rodents. Nope, to them, cats were sinister, agents of dark forces, whispered about in fearful tones by torchlight. You'd think that someone might have pointed out how handy cats were at keeping the rat population in check, but common sense wasn't exactly trending. Still, the deeper you dig into these crumbling papal proclamations, the more you realize that this wasn't just about cats. It was about fear, control, and a desperate attempt to impose order on a chaotic, dangerous world. And, like many desperate attempts, it backfired spectacularly. You glance at the next scroll, wondering what other absurdities lie ahead. As the night deepens and the shadows grow longer, you feel a phantom brush against your ankle, a ghostly reminder that history, like a cat, often returns when you least expect it. You step into a muddy street, ankle deep in slush and who knows what else, and immediately notice something odd. There's an eerie silence where you might expect the yowling of alley cats or the flick of tails disappearing around corners. The streets of medieval Europe are strangely devoid of purring, prowling cats. And the absence feels wrong. Back then, cities didn't exactly have sanitation departments. Waste of every kind piled up in the narrow lanes, and vermin thrived. Normally, cats would have been the unsung heroes here, stealthily hunting rats and mice, keeping the filth from becoming catastrophic. But thanks to Pope Gregory's decree, cats were now seen as Satan's foot soldiers, and they were disappearing. It's one of those weird moments in history where humans decided to remove a key piece of a very delicate ecosystem and then acted surprised when everything collapsed. Historians still debate just how widespread and effective the cat purges were, but there's no denying, fewer cats meant more rats. And more rats meant more fleas. And more fleas, well, let's just say Europe was in for a very itchy, very deadly time. Walking past crumbling stone buildings and thatched roofs, you notice how people have started putting out traps, poison, even charms to ward off the vermin. But there's no real substitute for the silent efficiency of a cat on the prowl. Rats scurry brazenly across the cobblestones, fat and fearless. You watch as a merchant swats uselessly at one with a broom, muttering under his breath about bad omens. Here's the irony: in trying to root out evil, they created the perfect breeding ground for it. The absence of cats didn't just make the cities stinkier and noisier, it may have made them deadlier. Of course, medieval people didn't know this. They couldn't see the connection between their escalating problems and the sudden drop in feline head count. Instead, they saw the worsening conditions as further proof of the devil's growing influence. Funny how when you go looking for demons, you always seem to find them, especially when you've just fired the best rat catchers on the payroll. And here's a quirky tidbit: not all areas were equally zealous in their cat-hating fervor. Some rural communities, far from the eyes of the church, kept their cats in secret. These clandestine cat keepers became a sort of underground resistance, risking accusations of witchcraft to keep their barns free of mice. Historians still argue whether the edict was enforced universally or if it mainly served as a grim encouragement for existing superstitions. After all, papal bulls didn't exactly come with a medieval SWAT team to ensure compliance. But the general atmosphere of fear and suspicion was enough to tip the scales. You can almost hear the sigh of relief from the rats. They multiply in dark corners, gnaw through granaries, and spread disease. Without cats to keep them in check, the rodents practically throw little rat parties in the streets. And you? You keep a wary eye on the shadows, half expecting a rat king, a real phenomenon where multiple rats get their tails entangled, to come waddling around the corner. This strange, catless chapter of history isn't just about superstition run amok, it's about how one decree, combined with mass fear, can unravel a fragile balance. You step carefully, avoiding another rat skittering past, and wonder how long this city can hold out before it falls completely to the real pestilence waiting just around the corner. A faint breeze stirs the filthy air, carrying the scent of unwashed humanity and rotting food. Somewhere far off, you think you hear a soft meow, real or imagined, who can say? Maybe the cats are biding their time, waiting for their moment to return. You turn a corner and find yourself standing in front of an ancient cathedral, its massive stone facade scowling down at you like an old judge. At the top of the steep stairs, a figure in flowing robes is delivering a sermon, not about salvation or charity, but about cats. Specifically, about how they're apparently in league with the devil. This, right here, is ground zero for one of history's stranger vendettas, Pope Gregory IX's infamous edict against cats. Issued sometime around 1233, Gregory's papal bull Vox in Rama wasn't just your average bit of church business. No, it read more like the script for a medieval horror film. According to the decree, cats, especially black ones, were accused of being part of satanic rituals. The document even included grisly descriptions of supposed ceremonies where a black cat would allegedly appear and walk backward toward a devilish idol. Completely normal accusations, right? Now, it's important to remember that the Middle Ages were basically a 24/7 fear festival. Demons, witches, heretics, these were the trending topics of the day. So when the Pope, the most powerful man in Europe at the time, declared that cats were up to no good, people listened. Or at least, they pretended to listen while side-eyeing their barn cats and wondering how serious the threat of eternal damnation really was. Historians still argue whether Gregory was genuinely obsessed with feline devilry or whether he was using this decree to tighten his grip on religious orthodoxy during a particularly tense period of church history. After all, rooting out heresy was practically a full-time job for the medieval church, and you needed a handy symbol of evil to rally the troops. Enter the cat. Now, here's the quirky bit. Before this point, cats weren't universally hated. In fact, they were often seen as useful animals, essential for keeping the mouse and rat population under control, especially in monasteries and granaries. Some places even considered them lucky. But Gregory's decree flipped that perception overnight. Imagine being a medieval peasant, hearing the town crier announce that the Pope says your cat is an agent of Satan. You look down at Whiskers, snoozing innocently in a sunbeam, and wonder if you're harboring a tiny, furry demon. It's not exactly a recipe for rational thought. And because medieval Europe loved a good witch hunt, sometimes literally, the edict led to brutal purges. Cats were rounded up and slaughtered in cities and villages. Public burnings weren't uncommon. Think of it as a very grim precursor to modern cancel culture, except with far higher stakes and absolutely no appeals process. As you shuffle away from the cathedral, the wind carries the musty scent of incense and something darker, fear. You glance over your shoulder, half expecting a robed figure to point a bony finger at you for merely thinking too kindly of cats. In the gathering twilight, you spot a flash of movement, quick, sleek, and silent. A cat? Maybe. Or maybe just a trick of the light. Either way, you quicken your pace, the shadow of Pope Gregory's edict trailing after you like a bad dream. Cats, it seems, weren't the only ones in danger. Anyone seen as too sympathetic to these sinister creatures could find themselves in hot water, or worse, at the mercy of an inquisitor's questioning glare. Because in this era, being on the wrong side of public fear could be deadly, and no amount of purring or chasing mice was going to save you. You duck into a side alley, the clatter of wooden carts and the hollering of merchants fading behind you. Here, the air feels heavier, thick with the damp scent of mildew and wood smoke. You can almost hear the whispered rumors swirling like mist around your feet, rumors about cats and witches, about the unspeakable things that supposedly happen under the cover of darkness. Cats, once just another creature scratching out a living alongside humans, had become symbols of something far more sinister. They were believed to be witches' familiars, supernatural companions gifted to witches by the devil himself. According to the medieval imagination, which, let's be honest, could rival Hollywood for drama, these cats weren't just pets. They were demonic assistants, helping witches cast spells, curse their enemies, and generally make life miserable for everyone else. You pause by a sagging tavern door, where a drunken man mutters about old Agatha down the road, how she has too many cats, how none of her crops failed this year, and how she must surely be in league with dark forces. Across the centuries, it's easy to see how fear and envy could fester into accusations. And where cats roamed freely, suspicions quickly followed. Historians still argue whether the connection between cats and witches was a deliberate smear campaign or an organic result of deeply rooted superstitions. Either way, by the time Gregory's decree hit the streets, cats had become furry red flags. And it wasn't just bad PR for cats, it was dangerous for their owners too. A woman living alone with a few too many cats might find herself accused of witchcraft. Neighborly grudges, old debts, or just plain bad luck could end in accusations, trials, and, if the dice rolled poorly, a very unpleasant meeting with fire or rope. One quirky detail, despite the church's best efforts, not everyone bought into the cat-witch connection. In some isolated villages, cats were still quietly appreciated for their practical pest control skills. It's the medieval equivalent of having a banned book hidden under your mattress, a quiet rebellion against institutional stupidity. But in larger towns and cities, things got ugly fast. Bonfires crackled in public squares, and cats, along with their unfortunate owners, were tossed into the flames. All of it done with a sick sense of righteous purpose, as if eradicating cats would somehow cleanse the town of evil. You shiver as a cold wind snakes down the alley. It's hard not to feel the weight of that fear, that crushing certainty that something as ordinary as a cat could bring ruin. And the worst part? This wasn't some isolated event. The fear spread like wildfire, fanned by sermons, gossip, and a general love of scapegoating anything remotely different. In a time when illness, famine, and war were constant threats, people desperately wanted something, anything, they could point to and say, there, that's the problem. And cats, aloof and independent, made the perfect target. A soft sound breaks your reverie, a faint, questioning meow from the shadows. You freeze, heart thudding. Another whisper of movement, a gleam of eyes catching the scant moonlight. A cat, bold or foolish, still daring to exist in a world that now saw it as an enemy. You kneel and extend a hand, but the creature stays just out of reach, watching you with a gaze that seems to hold centuries of suspicion. Maybe it knows better than to trust humans anymore. And who could blame it? You straighten up, brushing the dust from your knees. Somewhere in the darkness, the cat disappears, a phantom reminder of a time when fear overruled reason, and fur became a death sentence. The next morning, the streets are alive with a different kind of scurrying. You tread carefully, boot heels slipping on slick, grimy stones as rats dart across your path. They're bold now, fearless in a way that would have been unthinkable a few decades ago. Without their natural predators, they've multiplied, and they rule these streets like tiny, disease-ridden kings. You stop by a market stall where a frustrated merchant is waving a broom at a cluster of rats chewing through a grain sack. His curses fill the air, but the rats barely flinch. They know he's no threat. They're used to this, used to humans being helpless. Here's the thing, without cats, the balance shifted. Rats, and the fleas they carried, exploded in number. And fleas, tiny as they are, carry death. Flea by flea, bite by bite, the seeds of the Black Death were sown. Historians still argue whether the mass culling of cats truly made the plague worse or if it was just one of a dozen factors in a continent-wide catastrophe. But one thing's clear, fewer cats meant more rats. More rats meant more fleas. More fleas meant, well, a lot of funerals. By the mid-14th century, Europe's population would be cut by nearly half. Coincidence? Maybe. Maybe not. You glance around the market. Half the stalls are shuttered. The others are manned by weary-eyed merchants slapping at invisible pests. The stench of decay hangs heavy in the air, mingling with the sharper tang of fear. Fear of disease, fear of witches, fear of anything that couldn't be neatly explained or controlled. And here's a quirky detail for you. Some desperate towns actually tried to reverse their anti-cat policies mid-pandemic. It's the medieval equivalent of someone banning umbrellas and then acting shocked when everyone gets wet, then awkwardly trying to sell umbrellas again once they're drenched. Bring back the cats became a quiet, desperate refrain. But cats don't forgive easily. Nor do they forget. You can imagine them lounging just out of reach, watching the rats take over, their eyes gleaming with that inscrutable, ancient smugness. As if to say, you wanted a world without us? Well, here it is. The rats skitter at your feet again, bold as ever. You step carefully, mindful not to trip, not to make yourself a target for the sneering merchants who think anyone falling in the filth might be the next to fall ill. In the doorways, bundles of herbs hang from lintels, desperate charms to ward off the pestilence. They won't help, nor will the hollow prayers whispered by trembling lips. What they needed, what they unwittingly destroyed, were the sleek, silent hunters who once kept these streets clean. You pass a mural on a crumbling wall, faded but still visible, St. George slaying a dragon. You can't help but think a more appropriate mural would be a cat slaying a rat. Far less glamorous, maybe, but far more effective. The marketplace begins to thin out as people retreat indoors. Windows slam shut, and heavy shutters are bolted from within. You're left alone in the street, the only other living beings the rats that move like a living carpet in the gutter. A soft breeze stirs the air, carrying the scent of death and damp stone. Somewhere far off, you swear you hear a faint, echoing meow, like a ghost from a time when balance, however precarious, was still maintained by paws and claws. You pull your cloak tighter and keep walking, past empty stalls, shuttered homes, and scuttling vermin, haunted by the knowledge that sometimes, the worst disasters start with the best intentions, and a stunning lack of respect for the quiet, necessary work of creatures no one thought twice about, until it was too late. You duck under a low archway and find yourself in a cramped square, the kind where laundry sags between buildings and the stones seem permanently damp. Here, the whispers are louder, grim tales of death that moves silently, striking households seemingly at random. The Black Death has arrived, and with it, an eerie silence settles over the city, broken only by the shuffle of feet and the occasional toll of a bell. Historians still argue whether Pope Gregory's anti-cat decree directly led to the plague's devastation, or if it was just one cruel domino among many. Either way, the timing was suspicious. Cats had been culled, rats had multiplied, and fleas, the real culprits, rode their furry backs like tiny harbingers of doom. You move through the square, careful to avoid the darker puddles that aren't just water. The streets smell of rot and despair. Bodies are collected at dawn and dusk, bundled into carts and wheeled away with grim efficiency. No one speaks openly of it, but everyone knows. Death is everywhere, and there's no hiding from it. And yet, in the midst of this chaos, there's a strange, almost cruel twist. The very creatures that were once condemned could have been the city's salvation. If only they hadn't been burned, drowned, or driven away in the name of religious purity. You peer into an alley where a rat, fat and fearless, tugs at the hem of a discarded cloak. It's a grim scene, but what's more chilling is the absence of cats who, in saner times, would have dispatched such pests without a second thought. Here's a quirky fact. In some parts of Europe, particularly in places like Poland and Milan, where cat populations weren't decimated, the plague's impact was notably less severe. Coincidence? The people at the time certainly didn't think so. They thought it was divine favor. But with what we know now, you can't help but suspect the cats had something to do with it. You press on, passing a church where desperate prayers rise like smoke. Inside, priests intone Latin verses, faces pale, eyes hollow. Outside, the faithful gather, clutching talismans and rosaries. None of it seems to help. The plague doesn't discriminate between sinner and saint, between believer and heretic. It comes for everyone. At the edge of the square, you spot a flicker of movement, a cat. Thin, scrappy, and wary, it darts from shadow to shadow. A survivor. Maybe the last of its kind in this part of the city. You watch as it pounces on an unsuspecting rat, dispatching it with a practiced, deadly grace. You can't help but admire it. In a world gone mad with superstition and fear, the cat remains a creature of cool pragmatism. It kills because it must, because that's its nature. No sermons. No panics. Just survival. And maybe, just maybe, the cat will outlast the plague, outlast the priests and the merchants and the fearful townsfolk. Maybe it will reclaim these streets when the last bells toll and the fires burn out. The cat disappears into the gloom, leaving you alone with the stink and the silence. Above, a vulture circles lazily, its shadow gliding across the stones. You pull your cloak tighter and move on, stepping carefully, as if the plague itself might be lying in wait in the next puddle or the next breath of wind. Sometimes, history isn't shaped by kings or popes or armies. Sometimes, it's shaped by the absence of a soft paw, a quiet purr, and a glint of feline eyes in the dark. You continue through the labyrinthine streets, where life clings stubbornly to the crumbling edges of existence. Tucked away in the more neglected corners of Europe, you begin to notice something surprising, faint remnants of a different, older view of cats, hidden in mosaics and faded frescoes. There, on the worn walls of a forgotten chapel, you spot a tiny cat curled at the foot of a saint. Not a demon. Not an omen. Just a cat. Peaceful. Ordinary. Long before Pope Gregory's decree, cats had enjoyed a mixed but often positive standing in religious and folk traditions. In early Christian art, cats sometimes appeared as symbols of vigilance or cleanliness. Some monasteries even welcomed them to guard precious manuscripts from mice. But things got murkier as centuries passed. Historians still argue whether the shift in perception was gradual or sudden, but somewhere along the line, what was once a practical animal became a moral battleground. Was the cat a helpful guardian or a sly, malevolent infiltrator? You cross the threshold of a half-abandoned monastery. Inside, it's eerily quiet, just the sound of your footsteps and the occasional drip of water echoing in the darkness. In a forgotten corner of the scriptorium, amid piles of rotting parchment, you find another relic, a painted manuscript margin where a plump, cheerful-looking cat chases a mouse across the page. Here's a quirky tidbit. Medieval scribes were notorious for doodling in the margins of their manuscripts when they got bored. Cats were a favorite subject, often drawn mid-pounce, tails high and mischievous, no satanic symbolism necessary. It's a charming little rebellion tucked into the serious business of copying sacred texts. You brush your fingers lightly across the faded ink, feeling the centuries flake away under your touch. It's a small reminder that not everyone was swept up in the fear. Some still saw cats for what they were, companions, hunters, creatures that lived alongside humans without asking for much, maybe just a little food in a warm corner. Outside, the world remained brutal. Witches were hunted, heretics burned, and anything out of the ordinary was eyed with suspicion. But here, in the forgotten corners, a quieter, more tolerant history lingered. The sun breaks briefly through the clouds, casting a pale light through the broken windows. Dust motes swirl like tiny planets around you. You imagine the scribe, hundreds of years ago, dipping their quill, bored stiff, and deciding to sneak in a cat chasing a mouse between the solemn lines of scripture. Maybe it was a small act of rebellion. Maybe it was just whimsy. You smile, a rare feeling in this grim place, and leave the monastery behind. Outside, the streets are still plagued by rats, and the fear of witchcraft and devils still lingers like smoke. But in secret, in the quiet, cats endure. You move on, weaving through the city's bones, following the faint trails of a history that, despite the best efforts of popes and inquisitors, refuse to be entirely erased. Cats, it seems, have always been good at surviving, even when the world turns against them. You step into a narrow courtyard, walled in by leaning timber buildings, their beams creaking with the weight of age. Here, something peculiar catches your attention, a gathering of serious-looking men in robes, their faces lit by the flickering light of a single lantern. Their hushed voices carry just far enough for you to pick out a few words: traitors, subversion, and oddly enough, cats. In the messy chessboard of medieval politics, cats had become unlikely pawns. You see, the papal decree didn't just turn common folk against their feline companions, it also transformed cats into symbols of rebellion, heresy, and political dissent. Historians still argue whether cats were genuinely used as tools of political defiance or if this was just another layer of paranoia added to the fevered imaginings of the time. What's clear is that cats found themselves entangled in human schemes they couldn't possibly understand. You creep a little closer, sticking to the shadows. The men are discussing heretics, those accused of undermining the church's authority. And guess what? Owning a cat, or even being seen feeding one, could be used as evidence of heresy. It's like being caught with contraband, only fluffier and infinitely more dangerous to your reputation and your neck. Here's a quirky detail for you. In some cities, political dissidents deliberately kept cats as a subtle form of protest, a way of thumbing their noses at church authority without saying a word. A cat sitting in your window wasn't just a pet, it was a statement. An incredibly risky one. You watch as one of the robed men produces a tattered scroll, an inventory of confiscated property from a recent raid on a suspected heretic. Among the items listed is a black beast of ungodly appearance, translation, someone's poor cat, now another piece of damning evidence. You shake your head. In a world where loyalty was everything, and fear hung thicker than the smoke from the town's many hearths, even something as innocuous as a cat could become a political liability. It's almost impressive, really, how humans can turn anything into a weapon when they're sufficiently terrified. As you slip away from the courtyard, careful not to draw attention, you wonder what the cat's made of all this. Did they notice the wary glances, the sudden hostility? Or did they simply go on being cats, aloof, self-sufficient, and profoundly indifferent to human absurdities? You round a corner and nearly trip over a sleeping cat, stretched luxuriously across a doorstep. It blinks at you lazily, utterly unconcerned. A living act of rebellion, right there on the street. Maybe that's the real reason cats have always made people uneasy. You can control a dog. A horse can be broken. But a cat? A cat chooses. It always has. And in an era obsessed with obedience, with hierarchy and fear, that kind of independence was nothing short of revolutionary. The cat flicks its tail, gives you a slow blink, cat language for whatever, human, and rolls back into its nap. You smile and move on, careful not to wake the little rebel. The afternoon wanes as you stroll toward the edge of the city, where stone walls crumble into the countryside beyond. Here, among half-abandoned buildings and windswept fields, the world feels quieter. But even in the hush, you can almost hear the crackle of paranoia that once ignited whole communities. In one such village, you find the memory of Gregory IX's influence preserved like a bad smell. A crooked sign still hangs above a doorway, "Beware the cat and the heretic." It's laughable now, but centuries ago, this was no joke. Gregory IX wasn't just any pope. He was one of the more formidable ones, presiding over a period of religious zeal that would see the Inquisition gain traction. The papal bull Vox in Roma wasn't issued in a vacuum, it was part of a larger, grimmer mission, to root out heresy wherever it festered. And to Gregory, heresy wasn't just about theology, it was about order, about control. The world was full of terrifying unknowns, disease, war, famine. The church needed to maintain its grip, and scapegoats were essential. Cats, with their aloof independence and strange nighttime habits, fit the bill perfectly. Historians still argue whether Gregory personally feared cats or if they were simply convenient symbols for the broader evils he was campaigning against. Either way, the edict he issued started a grim chain reaction that spread well beyond the church's intentions. You walk past an old, moss-covered well where, according to local legend, witches used to gather. And wouldn't you know it, legend has it they always brought cats. The devil, they said, preferred the company of cats over all other animals, a belief reinforced by grim, imaginative tales of midnight packs and shape-shifting felines. But not all the stories were crafted out of fear. Here's a quirky one. In some regions, it was said that a cat could see the souls of the dead and protect you from evil spirits. So, while Gregory painted them as villains, some villagers still quietly whispered prayers of gratitude when a cat crossed their path at night. You turn back toward the city, the wind pulling at your cloak. The sun dips lower, gilding the broken stones and skeletal trees in a light that feels almost sacred. It's hard to imagine that this serene landscape once hosted such fervent fear and violence. And yet, it's easy to see how it happened. The Middle Ages were a time of uncertainty, when the line between the natural and supernatural was gossamer thin. People needed explanations, and when none were forthcoming, they invented them. A black cat sitting silently on a windowsill wasn't just a cat, it was an omen, a threat, a question mark scratching at the fragile fabric of reality. You push open the gate back into town, the hinges shrieking in protest. Somewhere behind you, a cat meows, soft, insistent, timeless. It's a sound that would have sent shivers down spines centuries ago. Now, it just makes you smile. Maybe that's the real tragedy of Gregory's decree. It wasn't just an attack on animals. It was an attack on the unknowable, on the simple acceptance that not everything needs to be controlled, explained, or feared. You glance back once more at the countryside, at the empty fields where once, perhaps, 1,000 cats might have kept the night at bay. And then you keep walking, the shadows lengthening around you, as the city prepares for another uneasy night without its most silent protectors. You meander down a quieter lane now, where the houses are smaller, the streets narrower, and the shadows deeper. Here, behind warped shutters and heavy doors, people still keep cats, but only in secret. You can almost feel the nervous energy in the air, the cautious glances, the hurried way curtains are drawn shut when you pass. In a world where a papal decree could make or break your reputation, owning a cat had become a dangerous act. And yet, cats endured, tucked away like contraband in dusty barns and low-ceilinged kitchens. You pause near a half-collapsed stable. There's a flicker of movement inside. You listen, the tiny, unmistakable sound of purring. Someone inside still believes in the old ways, the practical ones, the ones that know cats keep grain stores safe and vermin populations low. It's one of those quiet, defiant truths that no decree could erase. Farmers, millers, and housewives understood something the bishops and inquisitors didn't: you needed cats more than you needed purity tests. Historians still argue whether rural communities genuinely defied the edicts or simply turned a blind eye out of necessity. Whatever the case, cats clung to the fringes of medieval life, surviving on scraps and whispered kindness. Here's a quirky tidbit: some medieval folk believed that stroking a cat could cure you of a fever. It sounds ridiculous today, but considering the stress levels and hygiene habits of the average medieval citizen, a warm, purring cat might have been the closest thing they had to therapy. You shift your weight and peer into a crooked window. Inside, a wiry old woman cradles a sleek black cat, her fingers idly combing through its fur. She glances toward the door, nervous. Being caught with a cat could mean accusations of witchcraft, and worse. Yet she keeps the cat close, stubbornly refusing to let fear drive her to abandon it. You wonder how many others made the same quiet choice, risking their reputations, their safety, for the simple companionship and utility of a cat. Probably more than the church would have liked to believe. Out on the streets, the cat population might have plummeted, but it hadn't vanished. It had simply gone underground, hiding in the same way truth so often hides when fear takes over. Behind locked doors and under floorboards, cats slept and stretched, waiting out the madness with the same patient indifference that had always made them a little unnerving to humans. The old woman whispers something to her cat, and it blinks at her slowly, that unbothered feline acknowledgement. You smile at the familiar sight. Despite the trials, the pyres, the sermons, life went on. Cats went on. You move along, careful not to linger too long and draw attention to the stable, or to yourself. In the alleys and behind the shutters, you can almost sense them, the secret cats of medieval Europe, silent witnesses to an era's folly. The irony is thick enough to trip over. In trying to exorcise evil, the authorities had only ensured its spread. And those who understood the real value of a cat, their silent protection against rats, their calm presence in chaotic times, had to become outlaws in their own homes. The evening deepens, and with it, the shadows grow. You wrap your cloak tighter and continue on, the faint purring still echoing softly in your ears, a quiet rebellion against the heavy hand of fear. The streets narrow even further as you walk, the stone walls closing in like ribs around a hollow chest. The Inquisition's shadow looms here, heavier, colder. You can almost see it etched into the faces of the few passers-by, heads down, steps quick. This is no place for strays, human or feline. You find yourself at the edge of a public square, empty now, but the ground bears the scars of many gatherings. Scorch marks blacken the stones where pyres once blazed, and the air feels stained by memory. During these dark times, even the most innocent association with cats could draw suspicion. The Inquisition, originally established to root out heresy, expanded its net to include all manner of deviant behavior. Cats, by association with supposed witches, became another silent victim of these purges. Historians still argue about the extent to which the Inquisition directly targeted cat owners, but the fear was palpable. If your neighbor wanted to rid themselves of you, all they had to do was hint that you kept cats, or worse, that your cat spoke to you at night. No trial, no defense. Just a short trip to the Inquisitor's chamber and then, well, you can guess. You move cautiously past a broken fountain where moss creeps over the stone figures, ironically, a lion with its mouth agape, forever frozen in mid-roar. Another cat symbol, albeit a royal one, left untouched. Public symbols could remain, it was the living ones that drew the fire. Here's a grim but quirky detail, it wasn't just cats that faced suspicion. Other animals were dragged into the hysteria, crows, goats, even toads. But cats bore the brunt of it, perhaps because they straddled that unnerving line between domestic and wild, between companion and mystery. You think about the Inquisitors, robed and hooded, sitting in judgment, their minds filled with visions of demonic pacts and Sabbaths where cats danced around fires on hind legs. It's absurd. It would be funny if it weren't so deadly. In the growing dusk, you notice something small and quick dart into a crumbling doorway. A cat, young, scruffy, but alive. You hesitate, half expecting someone to appear and shout accusations, but the street remains silent. The cat watches you, eyes shining like twin moons, then disappears into the shadows. You wonder how many lives were quietly saved by such creatures, how many rats were eaten, how much food was protected, how much disease quietly held at bay, even as humans busied themselves condemning their best allies. The bells from a nearby church tower begin to toll, heavy and somber. You wrap your cloak tighter and move on. The Inquisition may have thought they were stamping out evil, but all they really managed to do was sow more fear, more darkness, and, inadvertently, more rats. And yet, somehow, the cats endured. They crept through ruins and alleys, unseen but ever-present, the silent, indifferent witnesses to human folly. You think about that young cat again, slipping into the darkness. It will find a way, just as its ancestors did. That's the thing about cats, they don't need our permission to survive. You leave the square behind, the charred stones glowing faintly in the last light of day, as if holding onto a memory the world would rather forget. You press on, the streets widening now as you reach a wealthier quarter of the city, stone houses with proper windows, heavy wooden doors, and iron knockers shaped like grotesque faces. Yet even here, where gold and silk buy a little more protection from the world's chaos, the fear of cats lingers. You duck into an archway that opens onto a courtyard, now overgrown with weeds. And there, barely clinging to a cracked wall, is something unexpected, a mural. Faded by rain and sun, it shows a woman seated calmly with a cat curled at her feet, its tail looped into a lazy spiral. Art, it seems, refused to follow the edicts. Despite the papal decree and the burning fires, people still painted cats. Small, secretive rebellions hidden in manuscripts, tapestries, and murals like this one. While public sentiment turned against the animals, art kept them alive in ways swords and sermons couldn't touch. Historians still argue whether these images were simple acts of defiance or if they were too deeply ingrained in the culture to erase. Either way, cats survived in the margins and on the walls, long after they disappeared from the streets. You run your fingers lightly along the cracked plaster, tracing the faint outline of the cat's slanted eyes. Here's a quirky tidbit, cats appear frequently in medieval manuscripts, not just as doodles by bored monks but as actual decorative elements. They lounge on the edges of illuminated texts, chase mice between the lines, and occasionally even bat at the robes of saints in the illustrations. One particularly cheeky scribe in a monastery in Germany even inked a tiny cat chasing a rat across the margin of a sacred psalm, as if to remind readers that no amount of divine song could keep the vermin away without feline assistance. You step back and take in the whole mural. Despite the wear, there's a tenderness to it. The artist captured something real, something defiant. In a world that burned witches and banned cats, someone still thought it was worth painting a quiet moment between a woman and her pet. It's a reminder that fear can banish bodies, but not ideas, not memories. The edicts tried to scrub cats from the streets, but they couldn't scrub them from the walls, from the margins of texts, from the quiet corners of the human heart. You move on, winding through alleyways where more signs of quiet rebellion linger. A bit of carved wood here, a scratched doorway there, small tributes to the creatures people officially feared but secretly cherished. Above, the sky has faded to a dusky purple, and the first stars blink into existence. Somewhere, not far off, you hear a soft, steady purring. You pause, listening, but the sound fades into the night like a forgotten lullaby. Art outlasts fear. Cats outlast everything. That's the lesson these walls whisper to you as you continue your journey into the deepening dark. The road slopes gently downward now, leading you away from the cramped city streets toward the quieter expanse of countryside. The air smells fresher here, tinged with the scent of damp earth and wildflowers. Somewhere in the distance, you can hear the faint gurgle of a stream and the rustle of wind through the tall grass. You're not alone. In the gathering twilight, sleek shapes weave through the fields, cats, feral but undeniably dignified, moving with the same careful grace they've always possessed. Out here, far from the reach of the church and its decrees, the cats thrive. And not just here. While Europe fell under the shadow of fear and superstition, other parts of the world, particularly the Islamic world, saw cats differently, very differently. Historians still argue about the extent to which cats were revered across different cultures, but there's little doubt that in places like Cairo and Baghdad, cats were treated with a respect that would have baffled a medieval European. You recall one particular legend. The Prophet Muhammad is said to have loved cats. One story tells of how he cut off part of his cloak rather than disturb a sleeping cat. In Islamic culture, cats were admired for their cleanliness, their grace, their quiet companionship. Mosques often housed cats, and feeding them was seen as a charitable act. Here's a quirky detail. In Ottoman Istanbul, entire charitable foundations, called vakif, were established for the care of stray cats and dogs. You could even bequeath part of your estate to ensure the neighborhood cats were fed after you passed away. Imagine writing a will today and specifying, "Please ensure my money is used for cat snacks." That's commitment. You can't help but contrast the images. In one part of the world, cats are burned as agents of evil. In another, they nap peacefully on mosque steps, fed by the faithful. It makes you wonder how different history might have been if Europe had adopted a similar attitude. Perhaps the rats wouldn't have thrived, the fleas wouldn't have spread, and the Great Plague might have been less devastating. Of course, that's just speculation. Historians still argue about the true impact of the cat purges, but it's a tantalizing thought. You crouch in the tall grass, watching as a pair of cats stalk something invisible to you, their bodies low, tails flicking with anticipation. They're survivors, these creatures. They don't need human approval to exist. They never have. A soft breeze stirs the grass, and the cats disappear into the undergrowth, shadows among shadows. You rise and continue down the path, feeling the weight of those twin histories, the fear and the reverence, the fire and the sanctuary. Two worlds, two very different fates for the same animal. And as the night deepens, you wonder, did the cats know where they were safest? Did they sense the places where their independence was respected, where their quiet company was welcomed instead of feared? It's a comforting thought that somewhere, even when the world turns cruel, there's a patch of sun, a quiet corner, where a cat can stretch out, blink slowly, and nap the centuries away. You make your way back toward the city, the lamps flickering to life one by one, casting long, uncertain shadows along the cobbled streets. The night air hums softly, crickets in the hedgerows, the occasional clink of a distant bell, and you realize how much quieter it is without the background music of cats. No mewling, no soft thuds of paws chasing invisible prey. But history didn't stop when Pope Gregory IX put his pen to parchment. Other popes came and went, each grappling with the world's chaos in their own peculiar ways. Some, inevitably, had different opinions about cats. Historians still argue about how subsequent popes viewed cats. There's little evidence of sweeping reversals, but there also isn't much to suggest the later church kept up Gregory's extreme hostility. Over time, the memory of the decree faded, overtaken by bigger problems, wars, plagues, and the occasional schism. You reach a small plaza where a faded statue stands, ironically, a saint known for kindness to animals. No cat at his feet, though. Only a dog, tail forever wagging in cold stone. Perhaps a safer companion, less controversial. Yet as attitudes evolved, so did the church's stance, slowly, quietly. Cats began to creep back into favor, not through grand declarations but through simple necessity. Monasteries, those bastions of learning and prayer, quietly welcomed cats back into their libraries and granaries. Mice and rats, after all, have little respect for sacred texts or blessed bread. Here's a quirky tidbit. There's a record from a medieval monastery where a scribe, frustrated with a cat walking across his wet ink, scrawled a marginal note cursing the cat's wretched paws. It's equal parts annoyed and affectionate, the sort of thing you'd expect from a person who, despite himself, had grown used to feline company. You smile at the thought. Even after a century of suspicion and fear, cats manage to weasel their way back into human hearts, or at least into their homes and granaries. Not because of some grand theological rethink, but because, as always, they proved useful. And because, perhaps, humans missed them more than they cared to admit. Imagine living in a world stripped of small comforts. No purring companion curled on your lap, no silent hunter stalking the night's unwanted guests. It must have been lonelier, noisier, and considerably itchier without them. The Church never issued a formal apology to the cats of Europe, no great papal bull reversing Gregory's decree. But over the centuries, the animosity faded. Cats slipped back into human lives, as cats always do, without fanfare or permission. You watch as a shadow glides along the edge of the plaza. A cat, sleek and black, tail high, utterly indifferent to your gaze. Perhaps a descendant of those early survivors, carrying in its blood the memories of fires, fear, and a stubborn will to endure. It's a small miracle, really. Not the kind sung about in cathedrals, but the quiet kind that pads softly on velvet paws and refuses to be extinguished. You continue your walk, the cat vanishing into the night ahead of you, as if guiding you toward a deeper understanding. Fear may shout, may burn, may rage, but life, in its quietest forms, always finds a way back. You trail after the cat's shadow a little longer, letting it guide you through the labyrinth and twists of the city until you find yourself near an old scriptorium. Its doors hang ajar, the inside lit by the dying glow of embers. Peeking inside, you see racks of manuscripts stacked high, their pages yellowed and edges frayed, a hoard of medieval thought, locked in ink and parchment. Among these ancient texts lies a forgotten treasure trove, medieval literature. And here's the thing, cats are everywhere in it. You pick up a manuscript, careful not to disturb the fragile binding, and leaf through the stiff pages. Amid grand sagas of knights and saints, you find odd little poems, fables, and bestiaries where cats slink between the lines, sometimes as villains, sometimes as cherished companions. Historians still argue about how seriously medieval writers took their depictions of cats, but one thing is clear, they couldn't resist writing about them. You stumble upon a passage from a bestiary, one of those medieval zoology books that blend fact, fantasy, and theology into one glorious mess. In it, cats are praised for their agility, their cleverness, their ability to catch mice. But it's not all flattery, they're also described as deceitful and selfish, basically the medieval version of a Yelp review. Here's a quirky tidbit. In Irish folklore, there's a creature called the cat sith, a spectral, fairy-like cat said to haunt the Scottish Highlands, enormous and black with a white spot on its chest. People believed it could steal your soul before it left your body if you weren't careful. So, casual bedtime stories. But literature wasn't all superstition. Some poets and chroniclers clearly had a soft spot for cats. There's even a surviving poem from a 9th century Irish monk, Pangurban, written about his beloved white cat. The monk compares his scholarly pursuits to Pangur's hunting skills, admiring the cat's quiet concentration. It's surprisingly tender, a slice of humanity stretching across a millennium. You imagine that monk, quill scratching across parchment, his cat curled nearby, both of them chasing their respective prey, mice and wisdom. Outside the scriptorium, the moon casts silver streaks across the street, and the city seems to hold its breath. Cats may have been demonized in sermons and feared in courts, but in the quiet spaces, between the pages of books, in the corners of lonely cells, they lived on. You gently close the manuscript and set it back on the shelf, the dust of centuries rising around you. In these hidden texts, cats were never truly gone. They crouched in the margins, lounged in poetry, twined through the inked words of monks and scholars alike. In a world of torch-wielding mobs and grim inquisitors, literature offered a sanctuary, not just for dangerous ideas, but for the simple, enduring presence of cats. You step back into the night, the stars scattered overhead like drops of spilled milk, and wonder how many cats are hiding in the stories we've forgotten, patiently waiting to be found again. The streets grow quieter still as you drift away from the scriptorium, leaving behind the silent books and their inked cat ghosts. You step carefully over loose stones and broken cobbles, Making your way to the old wharves where the city exhales into the river, the water sluggish and dark under the crescent moon. It's here, by the oily gleam of the riverbanks, that the full consequence of Gregory's decree begins to settle. Without cats, the city's fragile balance between pest and protector had collapsed. The rats came in droves, fearless and fat, gnawing through wood and grain, spreading filth and fleas in their wake. You crouched by a pile of refuse and spot a rat, bloated and brazen, dragging a moldy scrap of bread toward the shadows. No cat lurks nearby to stop it. And therein lies the rub. Without the cats, the rats flourished. And where the rats went, pestilence followed. Historians still argue about the exact role this played in the spread of the Black Death, but it's hard to ignore the pattern. Cities that kept their cat populations fared marginally better, their rat numbers kept in check by their furry hunters. Those that didn't? Well, you know how that story ends, badly, and often with a handcart full of bodies. Here's a quirky bit of lore. Some medieval cities, desperate to turn the tide, eventually reversed their anti-cat stances. Records exist of town officials quietly encouraging the reintroduction of cats, though they had to be careful not to look like they were defying church orthodoxy. Imagine the town criers, hear ye, totally not admitting we were wrong, but perhaps consider not killing all the cats? You lean back against a crumbling wall and watch the rats scurry, thinking about how humans, in their terror, had inadvertently unleashed a far greater horror upon themselves. It's the medieval equivalent of firing all your IT staff and then wondering why your computer has a virus. The river laps softly at the shore, a slow, hollow sound. You wonder how many lives might have been spared if fear hadn't blinded the people to the cat's quiet, essential role. If instead of seeing the devil in their green eyes, they had seen salvation. But history doesn't work on ifs. It works on fear and fire, on rumor and panic, and on the stubborn survival of those wise enough to slip through the cracks. You catch a flicker of movement out of the corner of your eye. A cat, sleek, shadowy, padding carefully along the wharf's edge. It pauses, regards you with cool, unblinking eyes, then turns its attention to the rats. The air seems to hum with a quiet kind of justice as the cat melts into the shadows, predator stalking prey, balanced slowly, silently restoring itself. You smile. The humans may have faltered, but the cats, well, the cats knew better. They waited. They watched. And when the world was ready, or desperate enough, they returned. The river flows on, black and endless, as the city sleeps fitfully under a sickle moon. And somewhere in the night, paws pad softly across stone and wood, unseen but vital, working to mend what fear had so thoroughly broken. The wharf fades behind you as you climb a winding street, the city rising steeply into a tangle of crooked roofs and chimney stacks. In these ancient quarters, the air feels thicker, weighed down by centuries of whispered stories, and many of them, you realize, feature cats. You pause outside a small, dimly lit tavern. Above the door hangs a cracked wooden sign, its paint peeling. A black cat, arched and watchful, looms over a barrel of ale. Even in the heart of fear, it seems, cats refuse to be forgotten. Inside, around low tables, the locals spin tales to pass the long, uncertain nights. You lean against the doorframe and listen. Their voices are low, urgent, punctuated by the occasional creak of the floorboards or the clatter of a mug. The stories swirl together. The cat who guards graveyards from evil spirits, the cat who can predict a death by sleeping on the soon-to-be-departed's bed, the cat whose eyes glow with the borrowed light of the underworld. Historians still argue whether these tales reflect genuine belief or just the timeless human habit of spinning mystery into myth. But one thing is certain, the cat lived on in folklore, not just as a villain, but often as a kind of mysterious hero, dangerous, yes, but protective too. You hear one man tell of a church grim, a spectral black cat said to guard sacred grounds from profaners and the restless dead. Another whispers of sailors who refused to set sail without a ship's cat aboard, believing the cat could chase away storms and bad luck. Here's a quirky bit. In some villages, it was considered good fortune if a cat sneezed inside your house. A single sneeze foretold prosperity. 3 sneezes meant you'd soon receive a visitor bearing gifts. In a world where blessings were rare and uncertainty constant, even a cat's sneeze became an omen worth cherishing. You step inside, slipping onto a bench near the fire. The heat soaks into your bones as you listen to the layered murmur of superstitions, a fragile net cast against the night's chaos. Cats weren't just feared, they were woven into the very fabric of the medieval imagination, a creature poised between worlds. Not fully tame, not fully wild. Not wholly good, not wholly evil. Just there. Watching. Waiting. Indifferent to human struggles yet somehow entwined with them. The fire crackles, casting shadows that leap and dance on the rough-hewn walls. Someone lifts a mug and toasts. To the watchers in the dark, the others murmur agreement, clinking their mugs together. You sip your ale and glance toward the hearth. Curled on a worn rug lies a cat, its fur a patchwork of shadow and smoke, its ears twitching at the sounds of the room. It blinks slowly, lazily, but you get the distinct impression that it's listening just as carefully as you are. Maybe it knows these stories. Maybe it's lived them. The fire burns lower, and the night thickens outside. One by one, the patrons drift away, their voices trailing off into the chilly air. You stay a moment longer, watching the cat by the hearth. It stretches luxuriously, yawns, and settles back down, utterly unconcerned by the night, the stories, the centuries of fear and reverence layered around it. Cats endure, in myth, in memory, and in flesh. They always have. And as you rise and slip back into the night, you carry the weight of those old tales with you, warmed by the knowledge that even when the world is most afraid, there are creatures who simply live, unbothered and undefeated. You walk slowly now, the tavern's warmth left behind as the night folds tighter around the city. The streets are almost empty save for the wind and the occasional gleam of lamplight catching on wet stones. And yet, even in the hush, there's a presence, furtive, watchful. You pause at a crossroads, glancing down a narrow lane. At the far end, two glinting eyes regard you calmly. Another cat, black as the space between stars, crouched in a doorway. Today, centuries later, the reputation of cats has shifted once again, and rather dramatically at that. No longer are they signs of devilry or omens of misfortune. If anything, they've become internet royalty, worshipped with a fervor that might make ancient Egyptians nod in approval. Historians still argue about when exactly the cat's public image turned from suspicious to sacred once more. Was it the Enlightenment's gradual chipping away at superstition? Was it simple familiarity winning out over fear? Or was it something deeper, an unconscious recognition that the cat, mysterious and self-possessed, mirrors something of ourselves? You pass a shuttered shop, its sign depicting a cat sitting serenely atop a book. A modern coat of paint, but the idea is old. Wisdom, mystery, comfort. No papal bull could erase that, not truly. Here's a quirky tidbit. During the World Wars, cats were unofficial mascots in trenches and battleships. They chased rats, of course, but they also provided a strange kind of morale boost. Soldiers wrote letters home describing their feline companions in the trenches with a tenderness that cuts through the grimness of war. In the direst of places, people still found solace in the company of a purring cat. You think of how cats have slipped effortlessly into modern life. They nap on laptop keyboards, photobomb conference calls, and command thousands of followers on social media. A far cry from the pyres and sermons of Gregory's day. And yet, the mystery remains. Cats have not changed. They still blink slowly at us with inscrutable expressions, still walk the line between tame and wild, aloof and affectionate. If anything, we've simply learned to accept them as they are, creatures that owe us nothing, that deign to share their presence, not from obedience but from choice. You reach the end of the lane and find the cat still watching you, its tail flicking lazily. There's no fear in its gaze, no acknowledgement of ancient hatreds or medieval fears. Just a quiet, living testament to survival, not by strength, but by patience. Not by submission, but by sheer, elegant indifference. The cat rises, stretches, and pads silently into the darkness, leaving you with the sense that history, like the night, is vast and tangled, but some things, quiet, enduring things, thread their way through it all unchanged. You continue walking, the stars wheeling overhead, thinking about how far cats have come. From agents of the devil to tiny, whiskered gods of the internet. Not a bad career arc, all things considered. And perhaps there's a lesson in that, forgiveness without forgetting, resilience without rage, survival by simply being. You smile and pull your cloak tighter against the chill, the echo of soft paw steps lingering in your mind as you move through the sleeping city. The air grows cooler as you make your way toward the city's ancient center, where time feels thick and slow, draped over the stones like a worn-out blanket. Here, amidst moss-covered statues and broken columns, you witness the full circle of history. Where once there was fear and fire, there is now something oddly reverent. You step into a square dominated by an old fountain, long dry and cracked with age. Perched on its rim are several stone figures, worn faceless by centuries of wind and rain. At their feet, living, breathing cats lounge with effortless ownership, curling into balls or lazily grooming themselves under the indifferent stars. No one bothers them now. They are, quite literally, part of the landscape. It's fascinating to think that these animals, once outlawed and burned, have returned to claim their place not just in homes, but in hearts and legends. Statues, murals, even festivals honor them. In places like Rome, entire colonies of stray cats are protected by law, fed and cared for by volunteers who call themselves gatar, cat ladies, in affectionate defiance of the old stigmas. Historians still argue whether this cat resurgence was a slow cultural drift or a deliberate reclamation of what had once been lost. But whatever the cause, cats are no longer symbols of evil. They're symbols of endurance, independence, and in a way, quiet revenge. Here's a quirky tidbit. At the ruins of Largo di Torre Argentina in Rome, a sanctuary has been established where hundreds of stray cats roam freely among ancient temples, brushing against the same stones where Julius Caesar is said to have fallen. It's as if history itself has bent slightly to make room for them. You watch as a ginger tomcat leaps onto a broken pillar, surveying his domain with the lazy pride of a king who knows no one dares challenge his reign. Around him, others lounge like furry guardians of history, their eyes half closed but always watchful. The irony isn't lost on you. Once branded as minions of the devil, cats now sit in places of honor, their quiet resilience a monument far more enduring than any edict or decree. No one sings songs about the inquisitors or the popes who condemned them. But the cats? They're still here. You move to the fountain's edge and sit, careful not to disturb the closest cat. It eyes you, assesses you, and decides you're not worth moving for. Acceptance, in its most feline form. In the hush of the sleeping city, you realize this is the true victory, not one won by force or noise, but by simple persistence. By being what they have always been. Quiet. Unbothered. Undefeated. The cats stretch and yawn as if to mark the closing of another long, complicated chapter in their endless history. You sit with them a moment longer, listening to the soft scratch of paws against stone, the deep, rumbling purrs that vibrate like the heartbeat of the night itself. When you finally rise and walk away, the cats do not follow. They have no need to. They remain, timeless and indifferent, sovereigns of a world that once tried so hard to burn them away. Some victories are quiet. Some legacies are written not in ink or stone, but in the gentle blink of an eye and the whisper of fur against ancient stone. The night deepens as you make your way back through the city, the streets now hushed and empty beneath a canopy of stars. Your footsteps echo softly on the worn cobblestones, mingling with distant murmurs of the past, whispers of fear, superstition, and survival woven into the very fabric of these ancient stones. You pause beside a weathered fountain, where a lone cat sits poised, its silhouette framed by the silver glow of the moon. It watches you, unblinking, calm as the centuries it has witnessed. This cat, like its ancestors before it, carries a legacy far richer than any papal decree could erase. As you look around, the city breathes with quiet life, the soft rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl, the faint murmur of unseen creatures stirring in the shadows. The same city where cats were once hunted now shelters them, a testament to resilience and the slow, patient undoing of fear. You think back over the long journey, from papal bulls branding cats as agents of evil, to the superstitions that burned them and scattered them like shadows, from the plague-ridden streets where their absence was felt most keenly, to the secret barns and whispered refuges where they persisted, from the margins of manuscripts to the heart of folklore, and finally, to this quiet moment of peace beneath the stars. Historians still debate many details, how much the cat ban fueled disaster, how much was coincidence, and what it all means for our understanding of fear and scapegoating. But one truth shines clear: cats endured. They adapted. They returned. And in their endurance lies a lesson for us all. Sometimes, the quietest presence, the softest footfall, carries the greatest strength. Sometimes, survival is not about fighting the loudest battle but about outlasting the storm with grace and indifference. The cat stands, stretches, and with a flick of its tail, melts into the night. You follow its path, feeling the cool air on your skin and the steady beat of history's pulse beneath your feet. As you walk away, the soft echo of a purr lingers in the stillness, a reminder that some legacies are whispered, not shouted, felt, not proclaimed. Now, dim the lights, let your breath slow, and imagine the quiet world where cats still roam freely, guardians of secrets, companions in darkness, and enduring symbols of survival. Good night.